Thank you very much for that introduction, Janae. And hello to everyone who is joining us here, whether you are part of the SGX3 immediate family or extended family. I'm very glad to see everyone today. I'm Nancy Marin. I'll be leading the presentation. Valerie McNutt is my colleague. She's on the call as well. And the first excitement of the day will be mostly me just setting up the slides. So give me 1 second. So if you have met me before or worked with me in any of the things I've done with SGX3, you know that my preference is to have conversations, not to give presentations. So I'm going to be presenting the findings from this project. Hopefully have built in enough spaces here for people to participate and jump in. And so feel free to make good use of the chat. Raise a hand, wave at me, let me know what's going on. I very much would love to hear your thoughts on this. As you will hear from the presentation, there are some things that you could call findings and a lot of things that are called just next steps along a long continuum. So with that, I will begin. The presentation today, which is probably about an hour of material and then conversation, is going to cover a couple of big areas. I'll tell you a bit about what the function of this study is. We'll talk about the methodology, but the meat of it will be talking about the findings in 5 big areas that Val and I explored. And then we'll turn to you a bit to think about what next steps will be, but we have some thoughts on that as well. So the Sustainability Blueprint Factory is actually part of a much bigger program that SGX3 itself has been hosting and has created as part of our current NSF grant. There are 3 different ones in the works right now. One is on material science. I think one is on, I believe, the other is on AI, and I believe that PI is with us on the call. And then this is the Sustainability Blueprint Factory. Several of, and I believe there are also others in the works as well, and there may be folks on the call who can share information on that as well. The logic is to bring the community together to identify next steps and very specific plans, blueprints, things that we could take forward, whether it's creating new tools, new platforms, whatever it is to help solve problems. The Sustainability Blueprint Factory, a little bit different. So that's, fair disclosure. It's not literally building something. This is actually sussing out what the current issues are and trying to figure out, again, still what next steps are and what practical next steps might be, but doing it through iterations, conversations with experts in the field, and hopefully soon with an even broader swath of the community. So, the result is this report, and hope you may have received it with registration materials, but if not, it is available, I should mention, on the SGX3 website, on the page relating to the blueprint factories. Did I get that right? Hopefully, Claire? Janae? Hopefully. All right.
That's correct, yes.
All right, good. In case anyone has not met me and I have not already tortured you with questions to create this report, I will introduce myself briefly. My background originally was in actually publishing. But what that did is that exposed me to a lot of questions that have to do with how information gets out to the world. I was on the side that had to do with marketing, sales, and distribution. And I was fascinated by that and used that to then ask those questions about the digital transformation when it came to scholarly content and material. So for the last 15, 20 years, I've actually been working specifically on the question of how digital information, whether it's science gateways or works in the humanities, go from the scholars who make them out to the bigger world. And I do that through research, through consulting, through writing, kinds of things like that. Val, would you like to say hello at this point?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I came to this project and have been working in higher education for about a decade plus. And this is the first project I worked with Nancy on, but I really enjoyed digging into the project and learning all the findings and talking to many of you. So that is me. Hello.
Great. And it's been great to work with you on this, Val. So here's how the project has gone. We called these 18-month investigations Mine might have been a little bit longer. Um, but the logic was to start with a phase of background research. And in my case, that meant going back and kind of rereading and re-examining the people's work that dealt with sustainability in the earliest days of it. And then starting to ask some questions. So the work involved first some focus groups on some defined topics, things that had to do with institutional support in particular. And then from there, we shaped a few key issues that were emerging and used that to allow ourselves to really dig in and explore them. So when you see the report, we spoke in some length with about 35 people in these interviews. And in some cases, it was very broad in the early stages, but in some cases, towards the end, it was very, very targeted because at that point, we were extremely curious about learning about a specific approach we had heard that was working. Um, and then, and then this year happened. And then we wrote the paper. And then as we're working on publishing it, um, that's a little silly image of a monkey wrench was thrown into the works. So a lot of good plans and good thinking about how you would sustain something have been thrown into very high relief as the funding landscape radically, radically changed. So before we get into the actual findings of the report, I thought it would be a great chance to just take the temperature of this group, people who are interested in gateways and care about sustainability. So if you don't mind, I'll ask Janae to fire up the first poll of the day. Very curious to hear as we start to talk about ways to sustain gateways, um, if anyone's having any particularly pressing issues regarding funding. So the first question is literally, what what's new? What's your funding grant status? Have you had a grant canceled? And this is within, to be fair, we're talking about within the last 6 months. Are you concerned that you will have a grant canceled? Do you feel that that is unlikely to happen? And um, you don't think grant funding is at risk, but you're concerned about other forms of risk. And finally, God bless you, we are not at all concerned. So that was the trick question. I'd be very surprised if that's the answer, unless you're actually not creating anything that's grant funded. So take a minute. I'll ask Janae to maybe let me know when we think we've had enough response here. And I'm glad that you've seen that. I'm just scrolling up on the interface I have here. But there is a second question, which is, how are you thinking about the impact if you are seeing these cuts? Are there any cases of folks who have already had to cease operations? And I actually see there's already one who's saying yes. Have we had to cut back? And we're seeing several are already reporting, or our work has continued unchanged. So I'm going to end the poll and share results so everyone can see. And so Janae, I just want to make sure everyone is able to easily see both, or should I scroll so that people see it, or they have the ability to do the scrolling themselves?
We'll be able to scroll ourselves.
Okay. All right. Well, okay. So we already have, and it's a small sample, obviously, but we've already seen 3 people on the call are reporting that they've had grants canceled, and another 3 are reporting, concern that this will happen. And I think on the second question, describing the character of that impact, seeing that some things will be cut. If I had to look into a crystal ball, I would imagine that that's probably the flavor for many people. Hopefully it won't be, an absolute closure, but it's going to be something. So I'll stop this share and we'll move on. And I will express my empathy with you and ask you to share more information, but I'm gonna share a little bit more about the framing of this first, and then we'll open things up. just want to make sure that I'm trying to clear that screen. Okay. So here I have mentioned that this is all about sustainability without actually sharing what this definition is. And this was not one of the things that we wildly threw into play in this particular study. And for a couple of reasons I'm happy to discuss. But the definition, when you hear sustainability come up in this presentation and in this report, is a definition created through other research that is intended to think about the basic foundations of sustainability. So I've seen a lot of great work that talks about very specific things you can do. For example, if you're a software project, or really specific things that you have to pay attention to if you're running a big digital humanities project. But I was looking for a definition that might actually apply pretty well, regardless of what the discipline is, but really speak to a process. So the definition that I'm thinking about when you think about your own gateway and is it sustainable, is you're looking for a cycle. It's the ability to generate or gain access to the resources, and that can be financial, grants, income of other means, or other things, not financial, volunteer time, that you need in order to protect and increase the value of the content, service, or technology, for those who use it. So the key here is, have you figured out what you need to run this thing, this gateway, the way you need to? And have you unlocked the value from people in your community to help you do that? And again, with no prejudice towards whether it needs to be a grant, whether it needs to be some other kind of income or revenue, or whether it's all volunteer, any of those work. So this definition suits me because it will also support our investigation in things that are not strictly speaking, just data focused, just software focused. So actually, before I go on, any questions or comments before I share what some of these big areas are that we covered in the study? So I'm going to ask Janae or Val to monitor the chat if there are questions showing up there.
Yep, we're
Okay.
good right now.
Okay. All right. So the way this paper is structured, and I hope you'll have a chance to look at it, this presentation is going to give you the shape of it, not all the content of it, but I want to signal what the big areas are because I think they're still worthy of examination. And if you're interested by this, hopefully you go in and read a little bit more. But we organized this by something that kept coming up in conversations in these interviews as a challenge. Same things keep coming up over and over again. Question is, has there really been no change or no improvement? And the answer almost all the time is, yes, it's still a problem, but yes, there's also been something that's happening in the last decade, last 15 years, and sometimes very significant things. So in the paper, we share what's the challenge, what are the directions where we see change happening, sometimes in a general way, and sometimes we actually looked at very specific examples, and then we can talk together about what the implications are and how evidence of good change could be brought even further along. So one of the first things we heard people say, and this is something that came up both with funders and with higher ed administrators, was that it may not be that there are too many gateways. That's a little bit cheeky as a title, but there are an awful lot, and sometimes too many operating in a very, very similar space, in a space that has very limited resources. Second thing is that given how many there are so many PIs who try to do everything. And what I mean by that is it's a beautiful thing to have the ability to get a grant for innovation and exploration and to follow things that suit your curiosity. And funders generally want to support that. But what it can do unintendedly is lead to consequences of having too many things that are operating in the same space, or having a little too much customization when it's not really necessary. And it's entirely understandable there are disincentives for building on someone else's project that already exists, even if it's what we all say we ought to be doing, because everyone is incentivized by getting a new grant. If you're creating something and you're a creator, you want to do something new and exciting. You don't necessarily want to use the most generic solution. So that was something we heard in several different places, both that scholars tend to prefer the more creative, independent work, and also the system itself, no matter how much we talk about reuse and collaboration, tends to incentivize against it. Wondering if anyone has any thoughts, agreements, or arguments with that before we move on. All right. So there are a couple of things we did notice that I think are worth calling to the fore. Is the first is that, again, the problem statement's a little bit of an exaggeration. There's a lot of collaboration that happens, and it's happening in a bunch of different ways. One of the things we thought was the most significant change over the last 15 years or so is that there actually are a lot of shared solutions. Gateways themselves are a shared solution in a sense, often hosting other PIs creating their own work there. So this is a category that we write about quite a bit in the report, including talking about very specific kinds of solutions that help people share. Like one example is even something as close as Hub Zero, which allows other gateways. And again, there may be some folks on the call who are very familiar with this platform that allows you to have your own platform on it with a differing degrees of customization. Even beyond that, there's a project called Cubes that has worked quite closely with the Gateways community. With that itself facilitates another layer of educators, science educators, who can have their space that exists within their project. So there are lots of examples of this where it is happening a bit more. There's another approach that we heard, which is from a different angle. And I didn't spend too much time talking about methodology in detail, but I will mention that in addition to talking to gateway PIs, we also spoke with people who represent different administrative layers at universities, whether they're heading up an open source project, working in a library or repository, and also funders. And so the topic here was raised to us by a funder. And the idea is one approach to solving the problem of having too many competing gateway-like things in the space is to play some fairly forceful matchmaking. So we've seen this before. There are examples that are in the humanities with, for example, the Mellon Foundation a decade ago, and more recently with NSF and NIH, where there are ways to write a call that actually encourages or requires partnerships. And then actually, Val, do you want to mention the example that we heard about from NIH?
The example from NIH of bringing together.
Yeah, so there's a list, there was a program actually created bringing together leaders of 7 different repositories, and Dataverse, Dryad, Figshare, Mendeley, Zenodo, a handful of these, to actually try to figure out how to make them interoperable, how to develop solutions together. But it was kickstarted by the funder themselves. So sometimes, and I guess the message here is these all sound like great ideas. They tend not to happen out of the blue for no reason. And I've seen it happen when a funder decides it's not in their best interest to fund multiple things that could be operating better together. But I would again open this to the group. When I look at the current funding landscape with what to me looks like a very dramatic and urgent funding landscape situation to deal with as agencies are shuttered and funding programs are ended, this approach to me has gone from being gee, that would be nice if we have time for it, to maybe the most important approach. I'm wondering again if this is resonating for anyone on the call as an area that could use some further exploration. So another approach, and again, this is a approach we all hear about quite a bit, is being able to use, and not only use, but to reuse and repurpose projects that exist, software and code that exists. It's a theme that comes up over and over again, and it can be challenging to see. And so I think that was just another theme, is that there are so many efforts to create and incentivize the use of open source code in particular, but whether or not it leads to that further building is the challenge. And it's not that it's not happening, but what helps it to happen are some of the the things that the SGX3 works on all the time. How do you figure out how to encourage people to use it? How do you make it easier for them to use it? How do you know how many people exist out there that might be interested in using and making use of it? And also, how do you create your documentation and everything else so that it is usable? So, question for the group: are you in agreement that there may still be some barriers to reuse, even though that's clearly a direction that has been cited over and over again as a path to supporting sustainability? If you do see a barrier for yourself, is it because it's difficult to find, either to find a gateway to partner with, to find the code that you might like to use, or anything else? Or is it that you find it, but it's just not a good enough fit? So here, I would just love to hear from anyone answering this question at all on what your experience is, whether you're one of the people who has said, this is actually not a problem for me, this is working great. Love to hear a little bit from you. But also, if you've said that you're not entirely sure how you would find something that's fit for purpose, I'd love to hear from you.
And then while people are kind of finishing up the poll, it looks like I believe Julia was commenting or in the chat about what you had asked previously about people sort of coming together. She mentioned that she created a signal group with some small gateways so they could all be connected and help each other if their funding was cut. And she mentioned that she was surprised that they hadn't already made the connections to each other and didn't know each other. So she said it has served them well so far.
Yeah, this, and I would say that, so I've just shared the results. We are recording this. I'll just go through and finish giving the presentation. Maybe we'll end the recording, and then maybe we can open the discussion there. So the next challenge is institutional support. And thank you, Julia, for your comment, as always. Next poll question. Because I think support is a huge issue. It always has been. My question today is, how has it changed? And I'll let you know a little bit about what we have seen. But before we do, again, in the light of what everyone has noticed as funding challenges, let's just say, have you seen actual changes on your campus? So if we could fire up that poll. So, have you seen that your campus is finding other ways to replace lost support? Has it just simply been reduced, or there's been no change? Okay. right. Well, again, I'm not gonna pause too long for comments here, but I hold that thought because again, I would love to hear more from the people who are saying that the campus is putting in plans to help figure this out. I think many of us know about the most high profile campus plans, but I know much less about what's going on if you're not Harvard and you're in the news every day. So one of the things we noticed is that, and again, I looked into this question many years ago to try to figure out what campuses were doing to support digital initiatives on campus. And there's always a range of ways to do this. But today, in the last several years, what's new is the emergence of these open source program offices, and it's a grant funded initiative. There are a couple of flavors of this from different funders, but it's been a real area of investment. And Val and I noticed from speaking to people is that the slice of what these open source program offices offer is yes, it's around supporting the benefits of open source. It's educating people about what it is. But their remit's a little bit broader than that. And in the case of Johns Hopkins, where we were able to speak to some people, it turned out that they are really looking at the full range of activities, not just around the code and the documentation, but around the audience development and around the user needs piece and community building piece, which ought to always be part of the conversation. It's just that they sometimes aren't, even if everyone knows that they should be. So I think that what we noticed was a lot of new investment. If we had been talking about this 15 years ago, there was a trend to put digital humanities centers in lots of places, or at a moment they were called digital scholarship centers, and they were similar. They all look somewhat similar. They bring together often education for people to educate students, faculty, and sometimes some support services. Today, the flavor we're seeing are open source program offices. My question for folks is, are these totally different animals, or is this just the flavor that we're getting now? And are there more things and more collaboration across departments and functions on campuses, to support this work? Okay, let me see. I'm seeing some comments in the chat that I'd love to.
There's been a lot of back and forth about reuse. Some people mentioning that it would depend on individual or group expertise, that discovery can be challenging, and then, basically finding the good fit. Let's see what else. There's interest in shared infrastructure, but it's hard for anyone to actively support ongoing operation of the infrastructure. So again, I think that gets back to what you're saying now a little bit about institutional support. And then lack of perceived institutional mandates for supporting the open infrastructure, those types of things. So that's what we are.
This is Martin. And thank you, Jeanette. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Martin, for jumping in on this question. Yeah, I think these are many different comments to respond to at once, but I'm delighted to just see the conversation happening in the chat. There is frequently, my observation, just over a lot of time, is just that we kind of know what's good for us. And by we, I mean, not me personally, but like the universities, anyone who supports digital infrastructure, everyone knows kind of what seems like would be a healthier idea. But without support from the highest levels at a university, this stuff is expensive and it's not the most exciting thing to issue a press release about. So it often doesn't get the love that other things do. I know that there was a Sloan and Ford joint call on digital, specifically on what open source digital infrastructure based on the Roads and Bridges report that came out several years ago. And kind of they've been doing rounds of research to understand how do you describe what the core infrastructure should be. So maybe we're just at a stage again along a continuum where we have to have a public understanding of the pieces that that really merit longer term core support. So everything doesn't look like a project. Thank you again for jumping in there. Another challenge, not a new challenge, but this theme came up in so many different ways through the interviews we did that we thought it merited including. The challenge continues to be at the project level, defining and delivering a strong value proposition. So I'm going to try not to get preachy here, but I'll ask the question a different way. If you're running a gateway and you could only save one key element of it, and I don't worry about the details of what it means to save it, but if there's one element you could save if you were on a sinking ship, what element would that be?
Nancy, this is an impossible question.
It's an impossible question, right? Who's it? Who?
Like
Tell me who
all
this
of
is.
them.
Yeah, they're all my favorite.
Exactly. They're all my favorite.
Yeah. We had once Juliana, who teaches the strategy course with me, we were trying to think of an exercise where you kind of draw a picture of your project, but then we force you to choose a different colored marker and just circle the piece. Just circle the element of it that is really the thing that makes this thing tick. There's other stuff that's nice, but what's the thing? It's hard to get people to pinpoint it. And given that I'm sure many aspects of many projects are important, but it often turns out that there's something in there or a couple things in there, but maybe not all the things that are that no one else could do as well as you're doing. And that's the kind of answer I think it's good for each of us to know about the work we do. So let's see what you said. Okay, two people on the call said it's the tech we've created. And I know, again, that could be lots of different things. That could be some cool algorithm. It could be the infrastructure itself. You know, it could be a lot of things. Probably could even be the interface. I mean, there's lots of elements of that. But it is interesting to me that of 9 respondents, only two on what we think of as a kind of a tech-heavy space said it's the actual technology. To me, that's interesting. 3 people said it's the content we've created. And on this call, that content could be data sets, it could be something else, it could be images, it could be anything. And so more said that's what it is. And then the community. And so that's pretty fabulous, like almost half the group, and again, small sample size, but it's interesting that almost half the respondents said it's the community. And that is a very important thing to acknowledge. Like, let's just put it this way, and I don't mean to be so bleak on this bleak day, but you know what, if we can't run the thing the way we're running it, but we still have all the people, maybe we can figure out whatever the next thing is going to be. So that's wonderful that there are so many who have developed communities that are so critical to the projects. I'd argue that if you have that, you'll probably have a pretty good shot at sorting out what a good sustainability strategy would be. So very interesting to see so much variation in this response. Okay, I just want to.
And there was some mention in the chat that the tech is always needing to be rebuilt anyway, so that perhaps might lead to why that got a little bit lower score than the community pieces. Although I agree with you about the importance of the community.
Yeah, I mean, but so this also dovetails, the value proposition kind of dovetails back into that first topic of how much needs to be unique about what we do, how much could be reused or repurposed from something else, without really damaging the heart of the thing you've built. And I think that's a tough question to ask. I think the moment we're in may force people to have to ask this because we may have to make some choices. So measuring value still complicated. it's not because people don't try. It's actually a difficult exercise to do, and it's almost impossible to do if you're the person who built it, because someone pointed out, how can you not love the thing you just built? So figuring out what will make it valuable to other people sometimes is best done by people who are not you. It can be a very kind of stark process, but it's an important process, and it leads often to a lot of important insights for how to grow or change the product or project or service. The other thing we heard was that measuring it, even if you've generated this value and you've defined a fantastic value proposition, proving it is hard. In the olden days, proof was number of sales, right? I mean, I guess the equivalent today is many different things. There are discussions about how we measure things that are not fully resolved, and it's not quite the same. And absent clarity around that, it can be difficult for not only people running the project, but the people deciding whether or not to fund it, to decide how to make decisions, to figure out who gets funded, who doesn't get funded. And it ends up being, if you have been writing these grant proposals or these assessments, a work of great creativity to describe impact in the ways we have available to us. So a couple of approaches that we noticed from talking to experts in the community. The first thing is, when it comes to value and defining the value, we heard pretty emphatically, and again, I think this is a discussion more than a great finding, but there can be a huge value in making sure that you're observing demonstrated need within the community, not looking for it and like generating data that proves you the thing you want to do, but really almost like a groundswell, a grassroots observation of something that is needed. If we go back into the archive of great expensive projects that were funded and did not succeed, there are several that were kind of top down, massive projects, massive expenses that never really took off the way the funders thought they would. And I believe we name them tactfully in the paper. But there's other lovely examples. For example, the example pointed out to us was in the science community within astronomy and astrophysics, just having a regular practice of once a decade doing a massive study of identifying what the big challenges are and what the great needs are, and having that be a tested way to figure out what has to happen next. There are other examples too at a more granular level. We spoke with a chief data scientist who just talked about defining use cases. So talk about, like, from the biggest scale to the tiniest scale, we just think educators need this kind of tool to use the data in this kind of way. And that's what drives her decision on what to invest in for their project next. She knows there's a need. She's observed it in the audience of users, and that will steer them towards doing it. Again, it sounds kind of obvious. It's in practice, we don't always see that happening. We still sometimes see, this seems like a good idea. Let's do it, and we'll build audience later. And we know that just doesn't work. So as we mentioned, another big approach that is still emerging. We're going to point you to things to look at, but I'm not sure that there are great definitive answers. There's lots of ways to measure the impact of gateways and the things that gateways offer. But they're very different, and they're very different depending on what the gateway seeks to do and who's using it for what. There's 1,000 different metrics. But when it comes to open content, open data, open books, things like that, there are several projects that have made some headway. We cite a few of them here. Make Data Count, the Open Books Analytics Service. There are some very specific projects underway. They're trying to figure out, how can you capture digital traces that show that even if it is at the level of downloads, but then another layer of engagement, citations and things like that, where where you're seeing things where even if everything is openly available and shared and now living in multiple places, we're able to pull some of that data together to come up with what hopefully someday will be a little bit more standardized way of looking at the impact of open content, open data. And then here's a shameless plug because I feel like it would be silly not to mention it. Understanding these things and defining a value proposition is actually one of the key things that we do through the SGX3 training program. And it's worth knowing, having some tricks and tools to figure out how to do this, how to think about it for your own project. So I'll mention that SGX3 offers some of those trainings. But also the NSF has a massive program called I-Core, which is super rigorous, involving interviewing 100 potential customers to start to develop customer profiles and understand their needs. So there actually are several training programs out there to do it that have emerged again in the last decade or so. There probably were always things that did this in the commercial space and startup space, but these are slightly more tailored. Ours is very tailored to the academic not-for-profit space. So taking ideas from the commercial world, translating them, but the strategy concepts are still very, very similar. The challenge, sustainable funding. So this should not be a shock to anybody. This still came up as a big issue. But one of the things we've noticed a couple of different types of approaches to funding, I would say, that are different. And again, I feel kind of silly talking about anything that has the word grant involved because it's a very confusing landscape right now. But I'll just reference this because I think it's an area to watch and I think we should be thinking about it. There have been in the last decade or so what I call these collective funding models that have started to actually appear. Some of them are farther along than others, but the logic is that instead of either people paying for something directly, individual payment models, we can get institutions to collaborate in different ways so that the fruits of the creation, whether it's a book or a platform, are made more freely or affordably available. So an example that came out of publishing was Knowledge Unlatched, where they have libraries pledge a certain amount of money, they pool that for a collection of books, and when they reach a certain target, they're able to make the books freely available to the community as open access. There are also funding initiatives that are either partnerships or actually shared funding, such as SGX in Canada, which again pools from different funders, invest in open as a similar logic, maybe a little smaller scale to fund pilots. And even this partnership with Sloan and Ford for the digital infrastructure, where you have a couple of funders working in tandem on a question they really care about. That piece is maybe working in partnership a little less innovative, but the others where actual money comes together and is shared in that way is a little bit different. There are other pilots that are a little bit, and I'll mention this tome pilot, which is a little bit afield from science gateways, but it's interesting for a different reason. It was a pilot a couple of years ago to see if it was universities working together, but the funding was intended to be a totally flipped model where a university itself would make money available to a publisher so that a work could be published open access by the publisher. And so it meant that the library wasn't necessarily spending money on a book to buy. It was the university investing in the intellectual creation of the book by the author, who could then bring that funding to the publisher. It was a total different approach to how you might consider funding some of this work so that it can be open, and putting the responsibility with the university that wants to create and preserve the knowledge rather than an individual scholar to buy something or buy access to something. So I'm mentioning that, putting it on the map here, because I think there's going to be more exploration in what some of these new, very different models and ways of funding look like. Again, particularly if we're going to see the federal funding landscape challenged. Finally, again, I'm putting this out here, so maybe someone knows better than I do if these still exist, but funders themselves were aware that sustainability has been a challenge. And so in the last decade or so, there were several tracks that were actually called sustainability tracks, where you could either apply for money to extend a strategy that you might have to build out a business plan that would help you become sustainable, or slightly sadder version of this, but I've also heard them called sustainability, tracks that are just, supply funding to essentially wind down a project and figure out where its assets go. But that funders understood that and started to engage in this space was definitely a key move in the last 10 to 15 years, acknowledging that funding it and walking away was not really going to be enough. So this was definitely a new approach, and we'll have to wait and see what happens, but definitely an important approach. Finally, leadership and staffing. People are really important. Without people, nothing works here. And we definitely heard a lot from our interviews about the challenges that this continues to pose. So we know how much work is involved in creating and maintaining gateways, and yet budgets for them are low enough so that we still very rarely see someone with a job of project director or executive director emerge as actual full-time professional job. It happens. It does not happen very often. And down the stack of job roles, it gets worse, where you see a lot of people attached with a tiny percentage of time, or covered only by soft money in ways that are not really, that don't lead you to feel like there's a lot of job stability. And that's not what you want for sustainability and security in a very important project. So those continue to be issues. Beyond that, we heard people talk. In fact, I know someone's on the call today who can speak to this. Just morale can be a real challenge, particularly when you want to invite new kinds of people into this space, people who have not traditionally been participating in gateways, who might be new to some of the ideas and intimidated by them. So there's been a lot of interesting new thinking about how you can broaden the scope of who gets to play in this space. So the first big approach I'll mention, I'll just call it the rise, like the professionalization of the space. That's a new thing. That's, again, 15 years ago, people did the work. Some people taught themselves how to code. Other people came in from other lateral moves to do interesting work in this space. But today there's actually something called an RSE, folks who are actually professional developers who are doing it, taking their coding skills and deploying them in academic space. So that's a good thing. That's a very good thing. And there is now a job description that can get hired. So that actually is a significant change in and of itself. And folks like the Software Sustainability Institute have done a lot to actually create that. And the other piece is the one I just acknowledged, which is when you have a lot of people to work with, how do you create a space where you can get the most and the best and the most enthusiastic people involved in a way that you're not just dealing with a small club of the initiated, but you're keeping things fluid enough to bring in people. And I know I think Julie's on the call today still. And I just remember we're including this quote from her because it really was so interesting as a way to think about, here we are talking about all these technological things, this business strategy, everything else. But she and her team think a lot about kind of people's lives, like how do they feel showing up at work? And underlying that, what's the process? Just how do they do their work? And how can they do their work in a way that encourages them to do it with enthusiasm and joy, and therefore probably better and quicker also. And her example was, we can't solve the problem of global warming if you can't even get your team reimbursed without 20 emails back and forth. And I thought that was a really clever way to show how something that seems quite mundane, like putting transparent systems into place, can actually have an impact on science. And she speaks much more eloquently about this than I ever could. So I'm encouraging you to look up Julia and her work. But it's a great, that to me, this was a fascinating approach to include, because it's not like a traditional business strategy or technology kind of fix. It's a very personal, very human kind of fix. And that has to do with thinking about where people's heads are when they show up to do the work. And I think it's fabulous. So, all right. Poll question number 6. You've heard what our big areas are that we looked at in this report. I'll encourage you still, I hope someone will have a look at the actual full report, but I would love to know your thoughts. What kind of support might be most helpful to you and your team over the next 12 months? Would that be information? We should have made this choose all that apply, because frankly, it may be everything, but information on funding sources, coaching on business practices, guidance on identifying new partnerships, or even a setting where you can meet with colleagues to discuss some challenges you may be facing. Right. So yeah, so I mean, I'm glad to see responses everywhere here. I was kind of curious if there would be other things besides this. It looks like, at least a couple people are responding that any of these would be useful. I know that I personally would love to see more discussion around this. Not to say discussion as opposed to action, but information sharing, where we need to share information about how people attached to different projects and different institutions can be supportive of each other. I'm wondering if there are comments about ways that this might be helpful that folks want to put in the chat that were not on this list. Okay, well, that's something we can keep thinking about. So I'm just going to, I have a couple of questions for us, and then I'll just ask us to ask Janae if she can maybe stop the recording, but keep the meeting going for a minute longer if you'd like. But I'll just say, to me, the issues that are raised were important when we studied them and when we heard people talk about them last year. After what we've seen in terms of agency cuts and specific grant terminations and the abruptness of them, on one hand, I feel like the paper may be a little bit quaint because it harks back to an earlier, simpler time. But the reality is that the issues raised there, they're urgent, and there are some of them that could be investigated as ways to more quickly take action. If a project is seeing an imminent cut, let's sit down right away and figure out what are the valuable elements of it and how can we make sure that it doesn't go away. If funding is stopped, and as many of the respondents to that poll question noted, a chunk of your funding is gone all of a sudden, how do you look at what the key parts are? And more importantly, can we have everyone looking to the left and right and identify partnerships that might actually have been a good idea, even if the funding landscape wasn't so bleak? But this may actually throw into relief, very sharp relief, what some of those questions are. When we teach our course, we always say a good way to figure out what's important is how important your gateway is to say, what would happen if you just kind of quietly pulled the plug on it for 24 hours? It just went dark. How many panicked phone calls would you get? And everyone laughs nervously. So no one's hoping to do that. But this is about as close to that as I think I've ever seen. So that's the question. Like, let's look at what's really valuable in the gateways we've got. Let's make sure that there's a plan B or there's a creative plan C that we can put into place so that it doesn't cause lasting damage. The paper does not get much into AI. I'm going to leave that for Jeanette and her team to discuss AI issues in the next up Blueprint Factory. But I will say that we did have at least one very adamant interviewee who said, you know, the question is how much of this AI could utterly change? You know, how much AI could be deployed on how much of whatever lives in a gateway to make much of it a much simpler task. You know, to which other interviewees said, that's crazy. It's much more complicated than that. It would never work. So again, I put this in the category of something I think is worth talking about, absolutely worth talking about. Which elements would be easy to manage in different ways? How could querying be done in ways that doesn't involve some aspects of the interface? It's all worth asking. Question dear to my heart is, I still feel that collaboration is on the table here. And what does a deeper collaboration look like? Whether it's projects that partner in a non-superficial way. Is it collaboration on a campus among things that look like a DH center and look like an open source center, but actually are asking pretty much the same questions of everyone there? Is it collaboration among peer institutions to band together? And again, there's some examples of this in the paper already. Should we be doing this more? Having institutions be the backstop to some of the questions around infrastructure? Or is it funders? And finally, it's almost a philosophical question, but it's a financial question too. Looking to the future, where should, and by should, it's kind of a moral question. It's not a scoldy question, but it is where ought responsibility to reside in supporting the tools and the data and infrastructure for research and learning? You know, how much responsibility should we be expecting from a federal funder, from a private funder, from a university, from the individuals who use it? It's worth a conversation. Where is the money? Where can it be reliably counted on? In whose service is it? To what extent should this be? Some of these elements be considered a public good and therefore supported in a long-term way. Other countries that have a more centralized decision-making apparatus around universities have solved this in different ways from what we see here. So there are other paths. Anyway, I will leave that here. And thank you all for joining me.